Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to round out our lecture of Module 2 by going over materials related to Chapter 7, or Audience Analysis. We're going to begin by discussing one of three features of audience analysis, the first being who, or demographic analysis. And so let's dive into a description and a few observations that we can relate to this. If we were to define demographic analysis, it would be assessing a group of spectators to appropriately convey oral content. A very dense definition, so let's distill it down into its constituent parts. Assessment of a group means prior understanding of a particular audience. To appropriately convey oral content means so that you can curate that content to an audience's needs and their expectations. So this refers to the applicable traits, expectations, and knowledge of an audience prior to engaging with the speaker, or perhaps even their topic, for the first time. Now, this is a pretty complex process, so much so that we have categorized different types of audience members, of which there are 5 main categories: stakeholders, enthusiasts, gatekeepers, experts, and nominals. Stakeholders are individuals with immediate and invested interest in your presentation. For example, a group of parents showing up to a local school board meeting to divine whether or not their school location is going to be closed in the forthcoming academic year can be said to fulfill the role of stakeholders, because they have a vested interest in the welfare of their child's education. Enthusiasts, however, are persons with either a recreational or intellectual passion for the presentation topic. So, if you've ever been to a convention, for example, such as a comic book convention or a pop culture convention, you may have seen individuals there that are extremely passionate about the topic, perhaps even more so than some of the speakers in some cases. Gatekeepers don't necessarily have any passion or vested interest in a topic, but they do control that topic and perhaps even that speaker's development and their resources. So, for example, if you've ever had to make a pitch to a prospective employer about why you're good for a position, or if you've ever had to apply for a loan, you've been speaking to a gatekeeper, somebody that has the authority to withhold certain resources or opportunities to you based upon whether or not you meet their expectations. Experts are listeners with typically a professional and extensive prior knowledge of the presentation topic. In other words, they are listening to see if the speaker is saying the right or correct things as much as they are for their own interests. And finally, nominals are individuals or audiences with a related interest or passion in either the speaking or the presentation topic. So, for example, if you have a speaker that audiences naturally flock to because they have prior engagement with them, it might not necessarily matter what that speaker chooses to present about. If the audience likes the speaker, they'll probably already enjoy the content. 2 observations to make about demographic analysis. The first is something that is iterated in your course textbook, and that is an audience's favorite topic of conversation is always itself. So the trick in making sure you curate content for specific demographies is to apply egocentricity, or make every topic about your audience, because audiences tend to respond favorably to ideas that impact their everyday life and their passions and interests. This all leads to something called voluntariness, which is the interval or degree to which an audience has prior favor of a speaker or message. The higher voluntariness of an audience, the more likely it is that they'll respond favorably to successive messages by the same speaker or by similar topics. Let's look at some ways that we can study demographics a little bit better. First of all, we can define it as the measurement and prediction of a specific population's overall behavior. And that means that we can study a population's composition, such as its assessment based on key behavioral indicators, such as age, sex, ethnicity, religious affiliation, income, and education. In other words, if a speaker can discern at least 2 or perhaps 3 or 4 of these key behavioral indicators, they can usually accurately predict an audience's most likely response to their content, and they can curate or tweak that content to garner a more favorable response. So how then do speakers determine the demographic accuracy of their information regarding an audience? Well, there are three factors: time or timeliness. Another way to say that is the more recent the information you have about your audience, the more reliable that information tends to be. The specificity of instruments. In other words, the more specific the information, or the more stringent the questions, or comprehensive the inquiries. And the intensity of the characteristics. So let's go to specificity. It's one thing to ask an audience whether they consider themselves, for example, lower income, middle income, or upper income. But it's an altogether different specificity to know the exact tax bracket, statistically, of all of your audience members, and to know the greatest concentrations of their socioeconomic status within those tax brackets. Intensity of characteristics simply means that there are some characteristics your audience shares that will be more applicable to your curating your content than other characteristics. For example, if I was speaking on a hot-button political issue to a group of males, obviously the age or average age of that audience is probably more germane to how I should curate my content than whether or not that same audience mostly wears boxers or briefs. So what's the takeaway from this? Well, we know that effective speakers surgically select positive audience characteristics. In other words, you have to choose what part of your audience you're going to appeal to whenever you develop your content and its delivery. In the same breath, audiences control the dynamic traits surrounding what they speak of and what they receive in regards to a speaker's message. You probably know that in the past, you've withheld part of your identity or personality because you didn't feel comfortable channeling it in certain circumstances. So whatever you appeal to in your audience, you need to make sure that their comfort level is met in regards to the empathic relationship between you and your spectators. With that in mind, folks, we're going to do a very brief exercise. I want you to watch a video segment that features an array of vintage toy commercials. And as you carefully watch the next 3 to 5 minutes of this video presentation, I'd like you to identify the message's most essential demographics. Is, for example, age, gender, socioeconomic status, etc. the most important, or can you find something that might not be listed? Also note the implied audience types that are being appealed to: enthusiasts, gatekeepers, experts, perhaps stakeholders, in your observations. Here we go.
They strike like lightning across the globe. A Cobra force more powerful than ever before, destroying everything in their path to get the raw materials they need to construct the ultimate weapon and rule the world. But standing in their way, the greatest fighting force ever assembled. Bigger, tougher, and more determined than ever to crush Cobra with awesome new combat divisions. G.I. Joe Battle Corps. We're gonna knock you cold. G.I. Joe Ninja Force. You'll be seeing stars. G.I. Joe Mega Marines. This fight's really getting ugly. And G.I. Joe Star Brigade. We gotta stop meeting like this. The lines are drawn and the forces of good and evil dig in for battle. And this time, the battle's bigger than ever. G.I. Joe! American hero! Catch all the explosive action in Marvel Comics!
Extra, extra, read all about it!
One of Dick Tracy's junior detectives has witnessed the killers E.T. and Flat Top leaving the scene of a crime. Luckily, he's got on the Dick Tracy two-way wristwatch, the best way to keep in touch with headquarters. The transmit button activates the voice monitoring light, and the built-in working watch keeps super accurate time. Will Dick Tracy get there, or will E.T. and Flat Top get away? Find out next time.
Dick Tracy, Vickers Vehicles and Watch Eat Souls.
Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure!
I'm Phyllis Preston Esquire, and I'll Ted Theodore Logan in concert.
And I'm Nick Play.
Speaker connects to figures and most set players to make figures play music.
Now on drums, that bodacious barbarian Genghis Khan! Yeah, our new pal from old China. Excellent! Let's rock and roll!
Squeezing their legs gets them jamming.
Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Party on, kids!
I'm Dr. Wily. My robots tonight will control the world. As soon as we get rid of that blue-wee Mega Man and his Robo Dog Rush. Bomb Man, make sure they have a blast. What? Mega Man's taking over the bomb? Good man, watch out. Mega Man can use your own power against you just like that. Okay, Mega Man, can you stop Proto Man and Guts Man at the same time? I don't think so. Mega Man, collect them all from Bandai. It's the incredible Crash Dummies! Whoa! Some days this job's hard to face. Now the Crash Dummies have a crash test center where slick, spin, and over dummies face the ultimate test.
Nice body slam!
There's even a place to crunch your crash car.
You guys really cracked me up.
Don't you be a dummy! Buckle your safety belt and leave the crashing to us!
The incredible Crash Dummies! Crash Test Center comes with everything shown. You put it together. Where you going for your next car? The Preview Cruisers are here and I'm dealing. Customer.
Just looking.
No problem. Twist and shout. Then you get out. Each sold separately. I love this car.
Hey kids, I'm here to tell you about two extremely famous plumbers, Mario and Luigi Mario, from the Super Mario Bros. Movie. You wanna know what makes them super? Cause they triumph over the evil Koopa and his brainless sidekicks, Iggy and Spike, using only their plumbing tools, and they battle the Goombas. Koopa's hideous dino-human army. Those Goombas are scary. The Super Mario Bros. Action figures, incredible. But don't worry, they're not real.
There's a new hero in town, a whirlwind of action that's positively Smokehead. Yes, dare to wear the mask. From zero to hero, the mask is one lean green crime-fighting machine. He's a hard-hitting superhero as he battles the evil mask-stealing Dorian. He's a quick draw too with maskitude. Eye-popping crime-stopping are just killing time. Even Milo's putting a bite on crime. Dare to wear the mask. Somebody stop me. Figures each sold separately. If your friends can get a hold on you, here's what you gotta do. Bring home all the action. You'll get more satisfaction when you bring home all the action. Get a grip, get a lock, get a hold on everyone. You'll have all the thrills, all the fun. Bring home all the action. And now the WWF Superstar. Bring home all the action. All day in.
All right, folks. So, let me ask you this. What sorts of behavioral archetypes did you see appealed to? Most likely, you chose either age or gender or probably a conglomerate of both. It's fairly obvious that these are appealing to young males, probably between the ages of 6 all the way to 12, right? And we know that because of a few clues that we've been given. Number one, the sheer volume of explosions and fights and guns that we see clearly appeals to a certain demography, or at least expectations associated with that demography, regardless of how accurate it is. Now, there were a lot of vivid visual details here, so let's also concentrate on all of the linguistic cues that we received. Notice that all of the toys were called action figures. So what's an action figure? Well, if we're being fairly accurate, an action figure is really little more than a doll, but obviously you would not use the linguistic sign doll in any of these advertisements, because it wouldn't appeal or curate your content to your intended audience. Now, what about the audience types? Obviously, enthusiasts or nominals were appealed to here. If you love the movie, you'll love this toy. Or if you're really enthusiastic about this intellectual property, then you have to purchase this action figure set. But also notice just how much stakeholders and gatekeepers were appealed to, the parents of those same youths. There were messages on the screen, polyvalent channels that said things like, figures sold separately, or you have to put these things together, sets not included. All of those are messages that are simultaneously being signified to gateholders and to stakeholders. Now, with that in mind, let's look at this passage from Pat Boone's Twixt 12 and 20. And as we look at it, I want you to think about those three things that make for good content or good demographic analysis: timeliness, the specificity of instruments, and the intensity of the characteristics. See if you can discern which of those three traits is not being upheld by this advice that's being given to teenagers about dating. I don't believe a girl will ever truly respect a man who lets her walk all over him. The reason is, he isn't a man. Naturally, I like this arrangement because I'm a normal male, and Shirley is a normal female. Sometimes, girls, if you let your husband boss the project a little, he'll wind up doing the work quite efficiently because, you see, it's his corporation. Take my first steady, the one that broke up in 3 weeks. She was a very pretty girl, a wonderful singer, much in demand, but she put too much strain on young love. She let me see her in her curlers, invited me over when she was suffering from a cold in the head. Next thing you know, even when she was all fixed up, I could still see those curlers and that runny nose. Well, as you might expect, this is probably not very good advice for contemporary teenagers when it comes to dating. This book, believe it or not, written in 1970, as little as 40 years ago, doesn't really fulfill any timeliness. In other words, it's writing to a group of individuals that is no longer as timely, and thus the content isn't as reliable. So, now that we've talked about those characteristics, let's finally discuss the third aspect of demographic analysis, and that is how. When we refer to how, we're talking about a procedure and a set of observations related to technique and style. Technique refers to all the strategic components of a presentation, which is based upon the careful preparation using the aforementioned audience analysis. So everything related to technique is established prior to the presentation, and refers to organization and structure of your composition, such as its outline, its structure, its proposition, its content, even its word choices, or the repetition of key words and phrases. Style are all of the decisions that you make during the delivery of your presentation itself, which derives from the application of technical decisions while presenting your content. So it's a mode of conveying your message based upon the discrete audience types and, more importantly, their responses during the speech itself. So it requires context-oriented decisions that you make while you're delivering the speech. To use a metaphor, we might consider technique our payload, like the megatonnage of an atomic weapon. Style is your delivery system, the B-2 bomber, or whatever military apparatus you're going to deliver that particular payload with. Technique, strategic components, and style, dynamic tactics. So with that in mind, we're going to look at what is probably one of the most, if not the most, famous speech of the 20th century. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream. And as you watch this, I'd like you to watch it actively, by trying to distinguish between the elements of technique and style in the speech. In other words, what are the word choices in the organization that King introduces before the presentation occurs, and what are the delivery tactics that he deploys while he's giving the speech. As you try to make observations about that, you can also apply ideas related to demography as well. Now, we're not going to watch all of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, but we will watch the first several minutes of it.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today
signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize the shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. And the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. They were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to...
All right, folks. You probably noticed, as you observed the technique that King is using in this presentation, all of the banking lingo that he deploys. Now, first of all, he begins this speech with 5 score years ago. A score, by the way, is 20 years, so 5 times 20 is 100 years. Remember, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech was given in August of 1963, exactly 100 years, or approximately 100 years after the Gettysburg Address. And as you know, the Gettysburg Address begins with 7 years ago. So the technique or word choice that he chooses puts him in a direct legacy with Lincoln. And that's probably why he's using so much banking lingo here. Promissory notes, bad checks, checks that are marked insufficient funds. In effect, what King is saying is that Lincoln's emancipation of blacks under slavery has come back marked insufficient funds because of the excesses and abuses of de facto and legalized segregation in the United States. But it's of course also couched in quite a lot of the early civil rights movement that is propelled by the vast economic opportunities that were afforded to blacks in the middle of the 20th century following World War II. Remember, World War II was the first armed conflict in the United States in which all veterans received the Montgomery GI Bill. So immediately after World War II, there were an unprecedented amount of blacks that were surging into what had formerly been white-collar professions, white in every sense. So there was an unprecedented number of black teachers, doctors, accountants, and lawyers. And that means that they finally had economic access to lots of the things that poverty had stricken them from because of segregation. But because of segregation, because of Jim Crow, they weren't allowed to eat at certain lunch counters, live in certain neighborhoods, attend certain schools. Remember, it's 1946, for example, when the first Green Book is published. The Green Book being a document that told blacks that finally had the wealth to travel which motels they could stay in and which garages they could get themselves fixed at if they needed such. But King does something else, and here's where we talk about delivery. Now remember, Martin Luther King Jr.'s doctorate was in divination. Dr. Martin Luther King was a Southern Baptist minister. In fact, reading an excerpt from Martin Luther King's earlier work, Paul's Letter to the American Christians, he writes, "The misuse of capitalism can also lead to tragic exploitation. This has so often happened in your nation. They tell me that 1/10 of 1% of the population controls more than 40% of the wealth of them. Oh, America, how often have you taken necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes?" So we can see that same banking lingo or that financial rhetoric. And for most people, the civil rights movement, or at least the early civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century, was couched in these financial terms. But King changes all that, because just like he puts those words about classism in the words of the Apostle Paul, so too is he delivering all of these banking moments, these banking keywords and phrases, with the fire and brimstone of a Southern Baptist preacher. Hitherto, civil rights was something that one could form a sociological opinion about. But after King's speech, civil rights and segregation became something that you were either morally right or morally wrong about, which had a seismic impact. And why? Because King knew his audience. Because King knew that while he was appealing to all of the enthusiasts and all of the stakeholders, the blacks that were in attendance at the Lincoln Memorial on this day, he was also speaking to the gatekeepers, the whites who would be deciding whether or not civil rights had any legal and legislative traction on their televisions at home. Carefully curating his speech based upon the demography, based upon timeliness, based upon specificity, and based upon intensity of those characteristics and behavioral indicators that he is appealing to. So, careful audience analysis can literally change history, if it's appropriately applied. And I think that's a good message to end our lecture and discussion on today. Remember, if you need any help with any of your assignments related to this particular lecture and discussion, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm looking forward to seeing your presentation to assignment.